Okay, so we're talking about financial market right now, okay? And yeah, I believe I talked about it last class. And okay, yeah. The role of financial market in the economy. Okay? And we've talked about this. Let's start again from very simple circular flow model, circular flow diagram of the economy. Right? We have households and firms. Households provide resources, and the firms produce goods and services with the resources, right? And then the households get paid for their resources, right? And then the households use the payments to purchase these goods and services, right? That's how the economy works. Right? Very simple model. Right? Then the question was, what if households saved some money? Instead of spending all their income, households decide to save some money, right? Then let's say that becomes a leakage, right? Instead of, let's say they received $1 billion in payments, right, in income, right? And instead of spending all $1 billion, they saved 20%, say $0.2 billion, and spent only $0.8 billion. Right? Then in the next round, the firms receive only $0.8 billion, and they have only $0.8 billion to purchase the resources. Right? So instead of $1 billion, this becomes $0.8 billion. Right? If the households again save 20% of their income, right, then it's pretty soon, the economy is going to shrink, right? And it may have to shut down pretty soon, right? Well, here the financial market performs a very important function. Right? The assumption is when the households save money, they will bring that money to either bank or some fund company, right? What we call financial intermediaries, right? Because when you bring your money to these financial intermediaries, you will receive interest on your money, right? So what the financial intermediaries will do is they'll find some people or some usually company who can borrow this money, right? And they will charge interest on the people who borrow money, right? And then they pay interest on people who supply this money. Right? So the idea is we have financial market. In the market we have demand and supply, right? And of course we have quantity of money here, or loanable fund, loanable fund, in other words, money that can be lent. Yeah? And the price of money is interest rate. At this point you can use nominal interest rate, or if you want you can use real interest rate. It doesn't matter, right? But when you borrow money, you have to pay interest, right? When you supply money, you receive interest, right? So that's the price of money. Okay? All right, so we have supply and demand. Right? We can skip to this slide for a while. Right? So take a look at this slide. Yeah? So the supply curve slopes upward, just like any supply curve, right? Supply of money, supply of loanable funds slopes upward. Who are the suppliers of this money? Who supply money to the financial market? Who brings the money to the financial market? Households, right? By saving, right? When the households save money, right? And that we assume that that saving will go to the financial market, right? So households supply money, and if you think about the amount of saving and the interest rate, if the interest rate is relatively low, let's say banks pay only 1% per year, right, on the money that households save, right? Then some people will not save, or some people will not bring that money to the bank, right? Because many times, in order to receive interest payment, you have to commit yourself, right? Or commit your money for a certain period of time. It's called the CD, Certificate of Deposit. Right? In Korean, what is it? Anybody know? You bring your money to the bank and you purchase this CD, or you put the money in this account, right? Then you have to keep that money in that account for at least 6 months or 1 year, or maybe it's 3 years, so 5 years, right? It has certain maturity. And when the maturity comes, you can get it back, right? Your principal and interest, right? Does anybody know the Korean word for this financial product? Have you heard of 양도성 정기예금? Certificate of deposit, right? So you have to commit your money for a certain period of time. If you need to use this money before the maturity, that means you have to break this commitment, right? Then there will be some penalty, right? So it is at least some inconvenience, right? If the interest rate is really low, right, then people will be reluctant to commit their money for a certain period of time, right? Because who knows, you may need to use this money pretty soon, right? So the quantity supplied will be pretty small, right? But if the interest rate is high, if the bank pays 10% annual interest, right, then of course a lot more people will bring the money to the bank, right? So quantity supplied will be larger, right? So that's why the supply curve is upward sloping in this financial market. How about the demand curve? Who are the demanders of this loan over fund? Mostly businesses. In introductory economics, we just assume that most of the demanders are business. Of course, households can borrow some money to purchase cars or houses or whatever, right? But mostly, we think the main body or main component of this money demand, it comes from the businesses, right? So when the firms try to make an investment, right, build a new equipment, purchase a new equipment, or build a new assembly line or new factory, right, they come to bank and negotiate the loan, right? Yeah. So if the interest rate is high, then the quantity demanded will be relatively small, right? Because again, it's a price of money, right? And when you borrow money which you have to pay high interest rate, then it is rather costly, right? So you think about it. When companies try to borrow money, they have certain project in mind, right? Say you're trying to develop a new product, right? And if you're successful, let's say you can expect 20% return on your investment. Okay. Then, what is the amount of interest you can pay when you borrow money, right? Well, of course, in addition to the interest cost, you'll have to finance, the material and wage and all kinds of other costs, utility, right? So if you expect, say, 20% return on your money, perhaps you're willing to pay maybe 10% interest on your money that you borrow, right? That's the maximum, right? So if interest rate is extremely high, right, then only those small number of projects that you can expect high return, right, will qualify, right? But suppose the interest rate, market interest rate, or the bank charges very low interest rate, like 3%. You can borrow money and pay only 3% interest, right? Then a lot of projects will qualify, right? Even if you expect only 10% return on your project, right? You can probably borrow and start the project because the interest cost is only 3%, right? So you can understand this downward sloping demand curve in that sense, right? If the interest rate is high, only small quantity of money will be borrowed, right? But if the interest rate is low, then the quantity demanded will be pretty large, right? Okay, so here the idea is, as long as we have free market for the financial product, or freely adjusting interest rate, right? Flexible interest rate, or freely adjusting interest rate, right? The market will be in equilibrium, right? And the quantity saved or quantity supplied, well, will be equal to quantity demanded. Make sure you understand that idea, right? The market will adjust, or interest will adjust, so that the market will be in equilibrium, right? And then at that point, the quantity demanded will be equal to quantity supplied, right? In other words, saving will be equal to investment Investment here means companies are borrowing money from the bank, right? And use that money to produce or to build a new plant or whatever, right? So the idea is whatever the amount that households save, right? That amount will exactly be re-injected into this pipe, right? In terms of investment, right? So there will be always the equilibrium. In other words, the economy will not shrink, right? Or it's not going to expand in this case, right? Because of the amount that leaks out here. This is called the leakage. Amount of money that leaks out of this pipe, right, will be equal to the amount of money that is going to be re-injected into this pipe, right? So the firms will always have the equal, constant amount of money available, right? So the next round, they will be able to purchase the $1 billion worth of resources again, right? No matter how much money the household saves, right? That entire saving will come back to the circulation in investment. That's the idea, right? Saving will be equal to investment, right? That's an equilibrium condition. You remember the concept of equilibrium? What do you mean? Yeah, no further change or no change, right? So the size of the economy will always remain the same, right? It just keeps going around, right? Going on without, decreasing or increasing, okay? All right, so what about here? For some reason, demand shifts. So let's say companies somehow feel very optimistic about the future. They think the next year will be extremely strong. Their sales will be extremely strong because economy will. They expect the economy to improve next year, right? So a lot of companies will try to invest. In other words, next year they expect their sales to rise, right? So in order to produce more, you have to build another assembly line or another factory, right? So let's say a lot of companies try to borrow money from the bank, right? So the demand for the loanable fund shifts out to the right, right? Then from the initial equilibrium, initial interest rate of I1, what are we going to have? This is the initial equilibrium, right? And initially this was the market interest rate. And suddenly the demand shifts to the right. What are we going to have in this market? What? Quantity demanded will be greater than quantity supplied, right? Because at this price, quantity demanded will be this much, right? But quantity supplied will be same as before because supply curve is still the same, right? What do we have that? What do we call that situation? Quantity demand is greater than quantity supply. Shortage. Right? We're going to have a shortage of loanable fund, right? Then, assuming we have free market or freely adjusting interest rate, right? Bankers find out that, hey, everybody is trying to borrow money. So many companies come to the bank and they want to borrow money, but we just don't have enough money to lend, right? So perhaps we can increase the interest rate, right? If we raise the interest rate, of course, our profit will improve, right? And we can pay higher interest rate to people who save money, right? So gradually interest rate will rise, yeah? And eventually we're going to come to another equilibrium right here, right? Once we come to this point, there will be no further change, which means this is another equilibrium, right? So at that point, what? Saving will be equal to investment again, right? So this is always a equilibrium condition. Right? What happens if, for some reason, saving was greater than investment? What's going to happen? Think about this circular diagram, right? Households saved, let's say, 0.2 billion, but somehow the companies, they didn't feel like this is a good time to borrow, right? They think next year will be another recession, right? So their products is not going to sell very well next year. There's no reason to build another assembly line if your products are not selling, right? So not many companies are willing to borrow, right? So even though households saved 0.2 billion, the firms borrow only 0.1 billion. Then what's going to happen?
There's going to be a surplus.
Yeah, and what about the circulation? What's going to happen to the economy?
It's going to shrink.
It's going to shrink, right? Because households spent 0.8 billion and saved 0.2 billion, right? So companies received 0.8 billion for their goods and services, and now they borrow only 0.1 billion, right? So the total money the firms have available will be only 0.9 billion, right? So instead of 1 billion, they're going to have 0.9 billion, right? And if households keep saving 20%, right, then it's going to gradually shrink, right? Right? So if this has happened, if the saving is greater than investment, the economy is going to shrink, right? If saving is less than, if saving happens to be less than the investment, or in other words, if the investment was greater than saving, what's going to happen to the economy? Is it possible? Good question, right? If households saved only 0.2 billion, can companies borrow 0.3 billion? Is it possible? What do you think? Any idea? Yes, it's possible. Because what? Well, there's a stock concept and flow concept in the measurement. Remember, we talked about that before, right? And the amount of saving here, we're talking about 0.2 here. This is a flow concept. Perhaps 0.2 billion per year, or per month, or per round of circulation, right? Every time that it goes around, they save 0.2, right? So let's say, even though households saved only 0.2 billion this time around, in the previous round, right, they saved the 0.2 billion, and companies borrowed only 0.1 billion at that time, right? So banks have some money already available, right? Right? In the previous round, say households brought 0.2 billion to the bank, right? But companies borrowed only 0.1, so banks already had 0.1 billion available, right? In the next round, the household it saved 0.2, right? So well, banks have 0.3 billion available, so companies can borrow 0.3 billion this time. Does it make sense? Okay? Yeah. So it is possible that investment can be greater than saving, right? If investment is greater than saving, what? The economy is going to expand, right? Because injection is greater than leakage, right? Does it make sense, right? Okay. So yeah, that's the idea, right? Here we talk about another situation. Here we have think about this kind of case, right? And they use the example of crowding out, right? Okay, let's talk about this after we discuss this. Come back to this slide here. So intuitively, we thought about this, the structure or the workings of the economy, right? And now we understand if saving is equal to investment, that means amount of leakage is equal to injection. That means that the size of the economy will remain the same, right? What we call equilibrium, right? We can prove it using some sort of equation here, right? Think about this. Total saving in the economy can have two different components. One is the private saving, saving by households, and public saving, saving by the government. Right? And the households, the saving is what they receive minus what they use, what they spend. Right? And they have two sources of income. One is the regular income, which is the payment of the resources they provided, right? But then they also have transfer payment. Transfer payment is something that they receive from the government without any without providing any goods or services, right? It's not the payment for any good or services or resources, right? But simply they receive it from the government. Examples are pension payment, welfare payment, veterans payment, right? Whatever, you know, just the government transfers to the household, right? So the households have these two sources of income, right? And out of their income, they pay for their consumption, right? And then they also have to pay taxes, right? So the difference between the income and the expenditure, the difference is the saving, right? That's private saving. What about the government? Government has only one source of income. Government does not provide and produce anything. They don't sell anything. They only charge taxes, right? They collect taxes from the individuals and the businesses, right? So tax is the only source of revenue, and from their income they spend. G is government spending. They purchase goods and services, and then they pay transfer payment. So the difference between T and this T minus G minus TR, that is public saving. Okay? So the total saving, if you add private saving to the public saving, we come up with Y minus C minus G, which is kind of obvious expression, right? Because after all, the total income created in the economy comes from resources, right? So when by providing the resources to the businesses, households receive the payment, and out of that total payment, tax is paid, right? And government simply use this tax money to, pay the transfer payment, right? So all this TR and T, the sources are simply income, right? So when you look at the entire economy, the only real source of income is Y, which is the payment for resources, right? And out of that payments, you subtract the consumption, which is the spending of the households, and also G is the spending of the government. Right? But again, this G comes out of tax money. Right? So total saving is Y minus C minus G. That's it, right? Right? So that's the expression for saving. What about investment? Think about the investment. Well, let's assume we have a closed economy. In other words, there is no international transaction, right? There is no international trade. Right? So forget about this net export, right? So then Y should be equal to C plus I plus G. Then if you rearrange that for I, becomes Y minus C minus G, right? It looks quite familiar, right? Because we just saw that in the previous slide, right? In the previous slide, we found S, total saving in the economy, will be Y minus C minus G, right? Which is equal to I, right? So in the economy, essentially, right? Saving should be equal to investment, and that's equilibrium condition, right? If saving is equal to investment, then the economy will be in equilibrium, right? Yeah. So what makes it possible, right? I mean, we thought about this, if saving is less than investment or saving is greater than investment, right? Then the economy will be expanding or shrinking. It's not going to be in equilibrium, right? But what ensures the equality between savings and investment? Can you answer this question? What makes sure that the saving will be equal to investment at any time? We talked about it today. Yeah? In order to make sure that saving is equal to investment, what do we need? What do we need to have this equality? We just talked about it, right? What if demand shifts out, right? Then at the original interest rate, this was the original or initial interest rate, right? But if something happens, the demand shifts out, then the saving will be here, investment will be here. They're not going to be equal, right? So, what makes sure that saving will become equal to investment again? Flexible interest rate, right? Or freely adjusting interest rate, right? So, whenever we have this, that's excess demand or shortage, right? Then the interest rate will rise eventually by having higher interest rate, right? We're going to have another equilibrium, right? And at that point, saving will be equal to investment again. Okay? So I guess you can answer it two ways. I mean, you can say, first of all, we need financial market, right? Because in the financial market, we have loan over, we can have the trading or interaction between the savers and investors, right? And you also need the freely adjusting interest rate in the financial market, right? So that we can have this identity, saving equals investment all the time. All right, makes sense? Okay, good. Okay, so here, actually this is a little premature because this, the last thing after chapter 15. Yeah, in chapter 15, we're going to learn about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And after chapter 15, you're going to have pretty good idea about how the economy works, right? You should be able to explain it, all the phenomenon, right, that happen in the economy, right? So after chapter 15, the rest of the chapters will be, the rest of the semester will be devoted to policies. We'll actually talk about economic policies, right? And this has to do with fiscal policy. Fiscal policy means the government tries to control the economy or economic activities, right, by using taxes and spending, right? Those are the two tools that government can use to control the economic activity, right? So here, let's say economy is currently in a recession, right? Which means there are a lot of people who are unemployed, right? And in order to bring the economy out of the recession, you have to make the economy stronger, right? So whatever situation you have right now, economy is in equilibrium, right? But that equilibrium level of income or economic activities may not be sufficient. Remember, I told you, equilibrium simply means no change. Equilibrium doesn't mean everything is perfect or balanced. Forget about those things, right? Equilibrium can be really, really bad, right? Economy can come to an equilibrium at 15% unemployment rate, right? Well, what do you do in that case? If you just leave it alone, then economy will stay the same because it is in equilibrium, right? So that's not acceptable. Government will have to do something to bring the economy out of the recession, right? In other words, they'll have to break the equilibrium, right? In which direction? Probably in this direction, right? Somehow, government has to make the injection larger than leakage, right? If the injection is larger than leakage, right, then the economy will expand, right? You understand that, right? So one of the things the government can do is increase the spending, government spending. That is one of the injection, right? Government spend more money to purchase goods and services. So, here's a government is another economic agent, right? So we have, let's say, government. Okay? Government collect taxes from the households and the businesses, and then they spend money, right? They can purchase goods and services, right, from the businesses, right? And and then they can also provide a transfer payment to the households, right? So taxes are leakages because money is taken out of the circulation, right? Right? But the government spending is an injection, right? So if the government increases their spending, right, then the economy will expand, okay, or become stronger, and that's one way to get the economy out of the recession, right? The trouble is, most of the government, they have negative balance in their budget, starting from the U.S. federal government, right? Just about all the governments in the world, right? The state government in the U.S., local government, South Korean government, right? All the local, 경기도, 강원도, whatever, right? All the governments are probably in their negative balance, right? So, how do you increase the spending when you don't have cash?
You print cash.
If you print the cash, the problem is you will have higher inflation, right? Because price level, if you think about it, is basically the ratio between the available amount of money and the available amount of real goods and services, right? So if you, let's say, you printed, you increase the amount of money by twice, right? By printing money, you double the amount of money, right? Then the price of everything will have to double. That's the idea, right? The price level is determined by the ratio between the available amount of money and available amount of goods and services. Right? So, yeah, go ahead.
Doesn't the expanded economy ease the inflation?
Expanded economic.
What does expansion of economy mean?
Oh, expansion simply means economic activities are getting stronger. So more people will be working, more people will be employed, right? And the amounts of goods and services will increase.
Will they be paid higher?
Oh yes. So the total amount, because more people are employed, the total income will be higher, right? And the total output will be higher. Okay, that's the idea of expansion, economic expansion. When you say ease the inflation, I don't think so. What we can say in general is it's actually the topic of next chapter. We have aggregate demand and aggregate supply, price level, and the income and output level, right? When we say expansion, we're typically talking about increase in aggregate demand, right? By doing something, right, we can make the aggregate demand stronger in the economy. So aggregate demand is overall demand for all the goods and services, right? Then typically, price level rises, right? So in general, when the economy gets stronger, we have higher inflation rather than easing the inflation, right? If you're talking about printing money, right? Printing money will bring the inflation directly, right? When the total available amount of goods and services is the same, you just simply increase the money supply by printing money, then the price of everything will have to double. Simple as that, right? So yeah, printing money is not a good idea, but government spending is one way, right? So by injecting more money, right? Here the aggregate demand can become larger, but the trouble is government doesn't have money, so they'll have to borrow, right? How does the government borrow money?
They issue bonds.
Yes, they issue bonds, right? Government bonds, right? And the government bonds will be purchased by households, right? Which means that they'll have less money to bring to the bank, right? So instead of bringing their saving to the bank, they saved in the government bond. Okay? So what happens if the households purchase a lot of government bond, right? Then the supply of loanable fund will decrease. It will shift to the left, right? And as a result, interest rate will rise. Simple as that, right? Because in the money market, in the financial market, right, less money is available for lending, right? So the price will rise, which means interest rate will rise, right? And the businesses, when they need to borrow money, they'll have to pay higher interest, right? So the amount of investment, right? The saving will always equal to investment again, right? So from L1, it's going to go down to L2, right? But that means the amount of investment made by the businesses will be smaller. Okay? So the situation will be this, like this. Here we have real GDP, which is what we use Y, right? Is C plus I plus G plus net export, right? And government considers current level of income. We're talking about national income, right? Not the personal income, right? Is insufficient. So they try to increase the real GDP, in other words, get the economy out of the recession, right? And they try that by increasing the government spending, right? Sounds good. The trouble is, when they borrow more money, it's going to reduce the supply of loanable fund like this. Interest rate rises, and the investment will decline. Okay? That's what we call crowding out, right? So we say the public spending, increase in government spending will crowd out the private investment, right? So we consider that not very effective, right? Not a very effective policy. Right? So the next few slides think about variety of situation, right? We already talked about this, right? Government budget deficit. Deficit means their spending is greater than their revenue, right? So if government spends more than their amount of money they collect in taxes, right? Then they'll have to borrow money, right? By issuing bonds, right? Then the supply of loanable fund will decrease in the financial market. As a result, interest rate will go up, right? And so on. Right? Desire of households to consume today. What that means is households reduce their saving. For some reason, households wants to save, spend today. I mean, let's say something. Let's say the quality of air became so bad. Everybody has to buy this air cleaner, air purifier, right? So households spend so much money in this product. Suddenly, so many households buy this new product, right? Or whatever. Let's say they came up with a very innovative product. Let's say smartphones, right? And suddenly they invented this something like smartphone, which performs so many different functions, and you just can't do without it, right? You have to have it, right? And for each one of the family members, right? Then there will be so much spending, right? So suddenly the saving goes down, right? Then, just like before here, saving supply for loanable fund will shift back to the left, right? Then the interest rate will be higher and investment will be smaller, right? And so on, right? Tax benefits for saving. Sometimes government tries to encourage saving. Again, this is something that's you have to ask question, right? If people save more, that means leakage increases, right? And that will shrink the economy. That will, the economy will become weaker if you save, right? But why does the government sometimes try to encourage saving, right? You'll have to wait until we have this complete analysis of the economy, right? Even though it has a negative effect on the current economy, right? The saving will expedite the economic development or economic growth, right? So that's why, I told you about this, the children's saving account that I used to have one as a child in South Korea. Right? The government required every school child to have the savings account, right? And encourage people to save. Right? Anyway, so if many times government gives the benefit to the saving, right? So when people save their money in their retirement account, right? You don't have to pay taxes on that money, on that portion of income, right? So If the government introduces the new benefit, then the saving will increase, right? And then the interest will come down, and the investment will increase, right? And so on. Expected future profits. Yeah, again, the companies expect economic boom next year, right? Strong economy, right? So companies try to make the investment. They will borrow money, which means demand curve will shift to the right, right? Corporate taxes. Yeah, this is an interesting thing. There's a lot of controversy about corporate taxes, right? In every country, in the United States, the Democrats, President Obama's party, right? Democrats, right, always try to increase the corporate taxes, right? And use that tax revenue to help the poor people, right? The Republicans, President Trump's party, right? They are always on the side of the businesses and the wealthier people, right? So they try to lower the corporate taxes, right? Well, a couple of days ago, we have new, minister, deputy minister, appointed, Professor Chang Ha-sung. What's his position? Is it 장관 or 차관? Used to be a professor at Korea University, right? But he's appointed this new economic cabinet position, right? He is well known as an anti-jabal guy, right? So I think yesterday he announced his intention to increase the corporate tax rate, right? He's going, yeah, especially for these large jabal groups, right? So he's going to, I think what he said was, well, we're going to apply the law evenly, fairly to all the businesses, but we're going to scrutinize what the jabals, these large jabal groups do, right? So, yeah, looks like the corporate income tax will increase in South Korea, right? Well, if the corporate have to pay higher taxes, right, then the demand curve will shift to the left, right? Because, well, companies will be reluctant to make new investment. Many times, businesses, the corporations get a benefit by investing money, right? When suppose they made $100 million profit, right? And if the tax rate is 30%, that means they have to pay $30 million in taxes, right? But if they invest part of their income, in other words, they built another plant, right, using $50 million, right, then they will be exempt. They don't have to pay taxes on that amount of money they invest, right? So that's the corporate tax incentives to induce investment, right? But if that kind of tax benefit is reduced, then the demand will decrease, right? Demand for loanable fund will decrease, which means the interest rate will be lower, right? And so on, right? You can think about those situations. By the way, Professor Chang Ha-sung is uncle of Professor Chang Ha-jun. Have you heard of Chang Ha-jun? He's the professor at the Cambridge University in England, right? And he's endowed chair, right? Endowed chair is 석좌 교수, yeah. It's a very famous, very honorable position. Right? Probably he's the best known guy among the Koreans as an economist. Right? He wrote a book called The Bad Samaritan. Bad Samaritans, right? Good Samaritans, I'm sure you have heard of, right? Good Samaritan is a figure in the Bible, right? A person who helps total stranger who's in trouble, yeah? Total stranger was in trouble, robbed by robbers, right? And beaten and bleeding, and this Samaritan helped this person, right? Paid for all this, I guess, the medical and lodging, put that person in a, so to speak, hotel, right? And pay all the bills, right? So Good Samaritan is a figure from the Bible. Bad Samaritan, I'm sure nobody has heard of, right? The gist of this book is when you look at the last 50 years, 70 years of the world economy, right? Those countries that developed earlier, like United States, British, French, or Germany, right? A lot of people think that, or on the surface, these countries helped the underdeveloped countries, right? A lot of these underdeveloped countries were formerly their colonies, right? And at the end of Second World War, there were many countries that became independent, right? Liberated from the colony, like South Korea, was liberated from Japanese colonialism, right? And this former the economic leaders, right? They, on the surface, they helped a lot of underdeveloped countries, but in fact, all these economic policies were driven by their own interest, right? And this underdeveloped countries weren't really helped, right? In other words, these economic leaders, right? Those countries who were already developed, right? They took advantage of underdeveloped countries like South Korea and so on, right? So he's calling these, the main powers, right? U.S., Germany, British, French, right? Or this economic strong, formal, already developed countries. They were bad Samaritans rather than good Samaritans. Right? That's the main gist of the paper, of the book, right? It's rather an interesting book, right? Yeah. If you have any chance, I recommend you to try that book. Any questions so far? So South Korea is rather an exception. Okay? There are many countries that became independent after the Second World War. Right? There are very few countries who actually achieved the economic development, like South Korea, right? Because of this unfair economic practices from the main powers, right? That actually prevented, right, or didn't really help the development of the underdeveloped countries. Right? But South Korea has achieved very, I guess, phenomenal, right, the economic development despite all these policies from the main powers. Right? Okay, here the last couple of slides. The first one, the business cycle on inflation. Right. So if you look at these periods of recession, right, these pink bars are recession periods, right, and the inflation goes down starting from the recessionary period, right? And it actually goes down a little further even after the recessionary period, right? That's obvious. I mean, but if you use the concept of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Yeah. Recession typically means aggregate demand shifts back, right? For some reason, the demand becomes weaker, right? People are not spending a lot of money. Either they are afraid of spending because they think that the future is not good, right? Or they don't have a lot of money to spend because they are unemployed, right? So whatever the reason, the aggregate demand shifts back, right? And that means the income and output will decline, right? Then what happens to the price level? Price level will decrease, right? So that means the inflation will be lower, right? Or in the extreme case, you can even have deflation instead of inflation. Price level actually goes down, right? Yeah. So either slowing down of the inflation, or in the extreme case, you can even have deflation. Right? That's the idea. What about unemployment? Of course, right? During the recession, unemployment rises, of course, because what? The aggregate demand shifts back. That means there isn't much demand for goods and services, right? So companies will try to reduce their output, right? And they will lay off some workers, right? So unemployment rate will increase during the recession, right? And that's it. As you see here, in the beginning of the recessionary period, unemployment starts rising. But even after the recession is over, it keeps rising for a little longer.